Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yankel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs. And the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008.
In each of our bedrooms, you will find a quilt on the bed. The white quilt came from Tom's mom, and the quilt on our bed was made by my mom from her polyester suits and clothes from the 70s. Whenever we look at these quilts, we remember our family members and our heritage preserved in quilting art. Today we're going to look at quilting art of another kind. Come along and see what I mean. I love quilts. Not only are they beautiful, but they remind me of the people who created them. In fact, my brother made us a quilt rack because he knew how much we love quilts. A few years ago, we were driving and saw what looked like a quilt on a big red barn in Wisconsin. Then we saw another one near St. James, Minnesota. They were barn quilts, and today we are with Ward Voorhees, who has several barn quilts and can tell us much more about this new art form. Welcome, Ward.
Well, thank you, Mary, and welcome to our place.
Tell me, Ward, what is a barn quilt?
Okay, a barn quilt is a large wood panel painted with a colorful design. Could be from a quilt, but it could be a free-form original design also.
Where did you first see your first barn quilt?
In Carver County, down by just southeast of Minneapolis. We were visiting some friends in that area, stopped for lunch, and in the restaurant there's some brochures about barn quilts. And we had a little extra time, so we got back in the car and drove around and looked at barn quilts.
Where did barn quilts originate from?
Well, they originated many, many years ago in the Appalachian Hills of Kentucky, West Virginia, in that area. People wanted to make some color on their tobacco drying barns, which are kind of drab-looking buildings. So they made these large barn quilts and hung them on the tobacco barns.
Do quilts always have to be on a barn, or can they be on a shed or in another location?
They can be anywhere. Like I said, they originally started out being on barns. But that art form has now evolved to where the quilts are different sizes. And on any kind of outdoor structure. I've seen them as small as a foot square hanging underneath of a mailbox. And the larger ones are more like 8 feet by 8 feet on a big barn.
How did you get involved with trying to establish a barn quilt trail here in Stevens County?
Well, we kind of fell in love with those that we saw in Carver County. And I got to thinking I'd like to have one of those on my shed at my place. So my wife and I talked about this a little bit more, and then about 2 years ago, a lady south of Eagle Bend, she has a consignment barn, and she had an open house, and she was also showing some of the barn quilts that she makes sort of as a hobby, but also as a business. And I fell in love with those when I saw what she was able to do.
Now, the Barn Quilt Trail, that involves the Stevens County Historical Society and the museum, is that correct?
That's correct. And the reason that this is under the umbrella of the Historical Society is that the Museum and Historical Society have a good reputation in Stevens County, and they have a good web page, and rather than creating our own, we're piggybacking onto the museum's web page so that we can get free publicity, if you will, and get the word spread out a little bit better that way.
What are all the steps that you went through to get a Barn Quilt Trail established?
Well, there's no right or wrong way to do it. The way I did it, after I had the 3 or 4 barn quilts in my place mounted and displayed, we had an open house at our place and rented a big tent and hoped that 30 people would show up, and we got close to 100 showed up. And the reason for having this open house was to just introduce the local public people to what a barn quilt trail is and what they can do to get on that trail. I formed a small steering committee, and from that we developed some broad guidelines and objectives on what we wanted to do. The first committee I appointed was a committee to develop a mission and vision statement, because you have to have something on paper to kind of keep you focused on what you're trying to do. And then we had a couple of 3 other committees that worked in various aspects of establishing a barn quilt trail.
Then now, what kind of steps do you have to take in order to do fundraising too? Because I believe you're putting together a brochure, is that correct?
Yes, there's a lot of things we need to raise money for. One of the things that committees that we developed was the application committee, because every barn quilt that's on the trail has to be accompanied by an application form, and that does several things. First of all, it helps us kind of keep record of who's doing what and where and when. And also it spells out the responsibilities of the barn quilt owner. They have to keep that barn quilt on the trail for at least 5 years, and they need to keep it in good shape. They need to keep the area around the barn quilt clean and neat. And then it also addresses some liability issues so that the barn quilt owner is protected from any liability issues.
Okay, now I'm going to go back to a basic.
Okay.
How do you make a barn quilt?
How do you make a barn quilt? Okay, the recommended way is to use plywood called MDO, and that stands for medium density overlay. It's the kind of plywood that the county and state highway department uses to make the outdoor signs. And it looks like ordinary plywood, but one surface is impregnated with a resin that makes that surface very smooth and hard. So it's very easy to paint a design onto that surface. So that's what we recommend in terms of kind of wood to use. The real critical thing is to prime it very, very well with at least 2 coats of a high quality primer to seal all the cracks and everything, because like I said, these are going to be out in the weather for at least 5 years. We want them to really be sealed up good.
Ward, did you specify that any of the quilts had to be a special size in order to be on the quilt trail?
No, some trails do specify they have to be a certain size, but the Stevens County Barn Quilt Trail, we're accepting barn quilts of any size, and they can be on any outdoor structure.
And then how do you mount them on the side of the building?
Well, that depends on what the building is made out of. If the building is a wood building, it's fairly easy to just mount the barn quilt directly onto the wood. If it's on a steel building, you may have to make a framework to go behind the barn quilt. That framework would be mounted onto the building first on the steel building, and then mount the barn quilt onto that frame. It's important that whatever you use to mount the barn quilt on the building, that we use stainless steel screws or bolts or whatever to prevent rusting, because if that exposed screw or bolt is going to rust, you'll get a stain on the barn quilt. So have to use stainless steel.
Ward, would you mind if we went and looked at your barn quilts up close?
I would love that. Barn quilts are colorful, but there's also a story behind each barn quilt. And it's the story behind the barn quilts that make a barn quilt trail really interesting. This particular barn quilt, the design is called Tulip, quite obvious. And the reason I chose this particular design was because I have a Dutch ancestry, and the Dutch people are famous for all the tulips. So I had to have something that reflects my hobby and also my heritage. The particular barn quilts, most of them are painted with a frame. Otherwise, if you don't paint that edge around the barn quilt, it just kind of fades into the background, and this makes it stand out a little bit more. And how they are mounted depends on the type of building. This is a steel building, and I built a 2x4 frame that's behind the barn quilt, and I bolted that 2x4 frame onto the steel building. And then I just attached the barn quilt to that wood frame using stainless steel screws and painted them so they another coat of protection against rust. And it probably wouldn't be necessary to paint over them because they are stainless steel, so they won't rust, but it just covers them up a little bit more.
Well, I didn't even notice them until we got up really close, so that
Yeah.
really helps to camouflage them.
This blue quilt, I mounted that at a angle because I thought it a little bit too boring to have 3 barn quilts in a row. I like the blue colors. It kind of reminds me of the sky blue that we are experiencing this morning and the many lakes in Minnesota. And also, if you stand back from a distance, it gives kind of a 3-dimensional effect, and it's supposed to portray movement. And both my wife and I are quite involved in a lot of volunteer activities in Stevens County. We always try to be on the move, and so that's why we chose this design. It's called a carpenter's wheel, and I'm not real sure why it's called a carpenter's wheel, but from my research on it, it relates back to Christ. And I don't quite understand, I don't get a feeling for a wheel in this, but apparently the person who made this original design was able to trace it back to Jesus and his occupation as a carpenter.
I noticed that on these barn quilts that there's no curves. Everything is blocked.
Yes, that's a little bit of an optical illusion. If we come over to this other barn quilt, this one is called a 12-point star. There's 12 points on that design. And from a distance, it looks like the petals are curved. And yet, when you get up close, those are all straight lines. And the way that you get these real nice straight lines and real neat corners is you tape using painter's tape. You tape one color at a time, and using that painter's tape, the color doesn't bleed underneath. So you get these real sharp distinctions between the different colors, and real sharp corners here in the middle, for example. You use a lot of tape, but that's part of the process. This really is a barn quilt that got me started on this hobby of having a barn quilt at my place. When I went to this lady's open house up by Eagle Bend, she had this particular barn quilt on display. And in the instant I saw it, I fell in love with it, and I said, I got to have a barn quilt. So that's the one that got me personally started on having barn quilts at my place.
When you picked the colors for your barn quilts, did you match them to the beautiful flowers you have in your yard?
Yes, I did to some extent. The colors in this one, for example, there's 2 things that attract me to the colors. I've done a lot of traveling during my career as a soil scientist and looked at different soils around the world, and all the soils aren't black. There's various shades of red and browns and even yellow soils. So that kind of reminded me of my professional career. But then in my garden, I have a lot of oranges and yellows in one particular part of my garden. And that just seems to be a natural transition from these colors into my garden colors.
Ward, these are beautiful barn quilts, and up close, they're really big.
Yes, they are. And I have some smaller ones on my property that I'd like to show you also.
Well, that'd be great.
Mary, this is a smaller barn quilt. This one is 3 feet by 3 feet square, and it's mounted directly onto a wood building. So I could apply the screws right directly into the wood without making a frame behind it. But there is a frame on this barn quilt, and it's this painted frame around the edge. And the reason for doing that, if I didn't have that painted edge on the barn quilt, this red would kind of bleed into this red and it wouldn't show up nearly as nice.
Is there a special significance to this barn quilt?
Yes, this one has a special significance to my family anyway. I had 3 older brothers who served in World War II. and one of them made the supreme sacrifice and did not come home. So it's in honor of my 3 brothers, and especially that one.
And then do you have other quilts too?
Yes, I do. I have a couple smaller ones mounted on the side of the garage, but they're made out of metal. And I just purchased them locally. They don't have any particular meaning, but it's another way of having a barn quilt.
Okay, so the barn quilts don't always have to be made
They
out
don't
of
always
wood.
have to be on wood. They can be on aluminum or steel or something that will stand up against the weather.
Ward, to me it looks like anybody could do a barn quilt.
Yes, they can be on any size structure, any outdoor structure of any size. It's an art form, and flowers are also an art form. And that's one of the things I've tried to do in my garden, is use flowers as another way to arrange patterns or different colors.
Well, you know, this is called Prairie Yard and Garden, so would it be okay if we take a look at all of your beautiful flowers?
Absolutely, I'd love to show you that.
Ward, your garden art really blends in and matches your palettes of art on the building too.
Well, I tried to a little bit. I tried to get the oranges and reds and yellows from that right-hand barn quilt incorporated into this part of the garden. The Rudbeckia, I think, especially pick up the oranges and yellows in the barn quilt. The Tithonia, Mexican sunflower, has the oranges in it. And the lilies behind you have the orange in it. Different heights, different textures, different art form, but it all kind of transitioned from the barn quilt into my garden.
These are perennials here, right?
Yes.
Now, do you also have a lot of annuals around here too?
I have about probably a fourth of my garden is annuals. Many years ago when I first started gardening, I had just about all annuals. And I've gradually transitioned into a lot of perennials now.
Do you start a lot of your own annuals?
I used to. I used to start between 2,000 and 3,000 annuals every spring. And the older I get, I find that's not so much fun anymore. So I purchased them now.
Well, and I noticed that you also have the marigolds back here, and they also blend just beautifully
Yes,
with the colors.
with the yellows and oranges.
You had mentioned this orange flower that was called...
Mexican sunflower. The scientific name is Tithonia.
Okay. I have heard that that is the one that's really good for monarch butterflies too.
Butterflies love that, yeah. And there's been more monarch butterflies in my garden this year than in the past several years. So they are coming back.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, do you have any particular plants that are kind of some of your favorites?
Well, the lilies, the Asiatic lilies, the Orient pet lilies, the daylilies, I have about 150 different varieties in my garden of those 2 kinds of lilies. One of the things that the plant breeders have done in recent years is to develop different colors in both the Asiatic lilies and the daylilies. And in the daylilies especially, they've been able to breed in a different form on the blossom. And one of my really special ones is something called First Twilight. It's a pale yellow one, and it's got a little crinkled edge around all the petals, and it's really different. And several of my daylilies have that new feature in them where the edge of the petal is all crinkled up. It's really attractive. The Rudbeckia, we have about 3 or 4 different varieties in here. One of them is Becky, which tends to be a shorter variety. There's Indian Summer, and I forget the name of the other 2 varieties, but they all have different colors and a lot of insects in here that are doing the pollinating.
So the pollinators really like this. Does this bloom for quite a while too?
Yes, this will bloom all summer, and it self-seeds. So I just started this patch with a few annuals that I planted probably 4 or 5 years ago, and they just keep reseeding, and I thin them out a little bit so we got individual plants.
Oh, so that's good to know that if you get this started, that they'll kind of just take care of themselves.
They will.
Well, this is a beautiful spot in here now.
The seed heads, they can be a source of bird feed during the wintertime, so we just leave these standing at the end of the growing season, let the stalks and the foliage catch some snow, hopefully during the wintertime, and next spring I'll cut it all down and wait for the new ones to come up.
Okay, so you don't actually cut them down in the fall?
No.
Okay. Where do you get some of these new varieties from?
Most of the lilies I get from out in Washington or Oregon. That's where a lot of the breeding is done.
Okay. So are you kind of gearing, you said, more towards perennials?
I'm gearing more toward perennials. I think they might be a little less work in the springtime, maybe a little more work in the autumn, but that's what I'm going to anyway.
What do you do with your annuals and your perennials in the fall? Do you clean them up in the fall or more in the spring?
Mostly in the spring, and the reason is I like to keep as much standing vegetation as I can to catch snow cover. It helps prevent wintertime loss. So it looks kind of messy during the wintertime, but it catches snow, and that's what I want to do.
Well, and when we have an open winter, like we sometimes do, I think that that's much better for the plants.
Yes, and I did lose a few perennials this year because I didn't have the snow cover, but that's a risk you take, I guess.
One lady told me that's an opportunity to plant something new.
There you go, yeah. Or to divide some of the bigger clumps and spread them out a little bit more.
Do you do that quite often?
Oh yes. Probably about every 3 years, the daylilies and the other lilies have to be divided. Otherwise, they get too crowded and they just don't bloom as nice.
Now, one more thing that I was going to ask is, do you do anything special with your barn quilts in the fall? Like, do you have to take them down over the winter?
No, they stay out year-round, and that's the reason we recommend that people use this MDO plywood and prime it real good. So they should stand up for 5 to 10 years without have to be repainted.
For one of the final things for our visitors and our viewers, when will the barn quilt be ready to view?
Okay, August 1, 2018 is going to be open to the public, and we have a bunch of printed brochures that are be available at the museum, the library, PRCA, several other places around the county. And people can go to our website and download a hard copy of the brochure. And the website is Stevens History Museum, all one word, .com/barn-quilts. And you go to that website and you can download a brochure. And that will have a map in it and a little thumbnail picture of every barn quilt. There's 24 barn quilts at 14 locations throughout Stevens County.
Wow.
And they'll be shown on the map so you can jump in the car or hop on your bike and take a trip around the county and see some color.
Now, do any of the people have quilts made out of flowers to go with their barn quilts too?
Not that I'm aware of in Stevens County, but I know in Illinois and Indiana there are some huge flower gardens that are designed with a pattern from a quilt. And oftentimes they are right in front of a barn quilt that's mounted on a building. And the combination of the flower quilt and the barn quilt is just a nice colorful combination.
Well, I also noticed that you have a clematis, or you have several clematis here in your yard, and the blue flowers on that really tie in beautifully to the other barn quilt.
Yes.
Can we look at that close up too?
Yes, you can. Yeah, we'll do that.
I have a question. I'm planting a new lawn and garden at my house. Can you tell me what soil factors I should be considering?
When you're starting or establishing a new garden or a new yard, the soil is one of the most important things, but it's usually overlooked. One of the most important things about the soil is compaction. And if you have a really wet or silty soil profile, the air gets squeezed out of the soil, and that does not leave any room for oxygen or for the roots to really expand. Another thing that can happen is moisture. If your soil is too moist, number of things, trees, plants, shrubs, have issues with that. This garden that we developed here, our tree peony garden, was in more of a wet area, so it is in a bit of a draw. So we did build it up with probably 40 yards of more sandier soil. It's called a 70-20-10, 70% sand, 20% peat, 10% soil. And this mixture was really important because peonies do not like to have, like many other plants, wet feet, or especially in the winter. This gives the plants opportunities to grow. Depending on what you're planting or what you're doing, this also helps on your yard too, making sure you have proper soil, not too much clay, having good porosity, and then somewhat of a sandier profile helps with the compaction. When you're investing into a new yard or to a new garden, some plants, like some of these tree peonies, are quite expensive, $50 to $150 wholesale. You don't want to put that or your new $300 ball and burlap tree. You don't want to put that into what we consider a 2-cent hole, construction material that happens quite a bit, that's left over from new construction, heavy clay, compacted material. Put a few dollars worth of soil, proper soil in around it, and that'll be a good investment for your trees and for your garden, in the long run.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Ward, what is this plant that matches the beautiful blue in your barn quilt?
This is a clematis, and this particular variety is Jack Manny.
Oh, well, it has such beautiful blue colors. Does this bloom for quite a while?
Oh yes, it'll bloom. Well, you can see a lot of the blossoms are done now, but it'll have color for almost the rest of the summer.
Well, even when it's done blooming, I think that these have a lot of interest too.
Interesting, different structure to it.
And then I also noticed that there's a shrub that you have by your sidewalk.
Yes.
That also matches the one barn quilt. So pretty. What is that?
That is a spirea. And that's a very common plant. Everybody can grow a spirea.
You say everybody can. It takes what, sun or shade?
Full sun.
Okay. And then do you trim that down to keep it looking nice?
Yes, I do. Every spring I'll go in there and do some, probably trim it back by a third or so.
Oh.
Then it'll get bushier.
Well, it has the different shades of the earth tones, just like your barn quilt.
Yes, it does. It matches quite well.
Thank you so much for letting us come and see your barn quilts and your beautiful yard.
You're very welcome anytime.
Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yakel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs. And the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008.